I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. Today I'm speaking with KATIE EBBITT, a poet and therapist living in New York City.
I think I want to begin talking a little bit about community, just because I guess I associate you with kind of community building, and it was kind of strange reflecting this morning and just thinking about what I wanted to talk about, how much the cult has been involved in kind of the community structures that I've built. So I wanted to talk about that a little. My family comes from a Catholic background, and I wasn't raised Catholic, but I do think there's so much ceremony in Catholicism, and particularly, I think, since my family was raised Irish Catholic, and I think the women were much more religious than kind of their male counterparts. There's a lot of reverence for the cult of the Virgin, and just a lot of iconography, and kind of, I think, prayerfulness, and also kind of art practice that came out of the Virgin. And I guess I was just thinking about kind of community structures that I've belonged in, and kind of the aestheticism which has been attached to all of those things. And I think for me, connectivity is so, it's a spiritual practice, and so I've been thinking about that.
And I feel like you could see that a lot in your poetry.
Yeah, I mean, my poetry, I think I really do write for myself. It's something, I think there are very few things I feel kind of are singularly mine, and I think, like, sex is one of those things, and poetry is one of those things as well that I can kind of claim, and I think I don't feel a lot of individualization in my life, but for some reason with poetry, it almost kind of, it's, and I like being someone who's, like, highly connected. But I do think with kind of, like, poetry, I feel very distilled, and kind of feel like this sense of, it's not even clarity, but it is kind of, it's like very kind of ego based. Like, it's something that it's just incredibly, like, it just feels kind of like this materialization of, like, all of these things I want for myself, and it's very powerful in that way. But yeah, with poetry, I think I was I kind of came to writing a little bit late. I like always knew that I wanted to write, but there's this kind of slow process of me really being able to find the language. And I think when I was younger, I, like, desperately wanted to write, and, like, kind of would cry about it all of the time, just because I like just couldn't find the words. And finally, it kind of clicked for me a little bit, probably when I was around 23. And part of that was I was living in Ireland at the time, and went into Dublin, and there was this show that was happening at a public library that was about Yeats. And I just, I'd heard about automatic writing before, but hadn't really thought about it as pertaining to my own practice, and just there was a lot of focus kind of on the women in Yeats's life, particularly his wife, Georgie Hyde-Lee, and I was just very, I just felt very kind of, like, connected to this legacy of kind of writing, and how writing could be something which was a spiritual channel. But it really kind of helped liberate me a little bit in terms of my process, because I think I was, it just, something wasn't connecting, and all of a sudden when I kind of began to do it in a more kind of, like, that my consciousness wasn't like so involved in it and was really kind of more of this kind of like internal flow, that things really began to actually kind of come into place. And actually it was like very liberating for me as a person as well. Like, I think I was being way too pedantic before then.
What do you think it was about Yeats in particular?
Honestly, I think it was actually more about kind of the women in Yeats's life. And I think, yeah, because I don't think really Yeats, I don't think he would be a particularly like noted poet if it wasn't for the women who had kind of shaped him. And, I think that's true for so many different artists. But, I kind of think similarly, like Georgie Hyde Lee, for me, kind of coming into contact with the work that she was doing, like particularly around the subconscious. I think it opened something, and I think it kind of opened, and maybe opened something in a similar way for Yeats. Because I think Ireland, when I was living there, I was living in this community that was in a very rural area of Ireland. It was in County Kildare. And I was working, it was a life-sharing community, and it also kind of had connection to occult practice. It was, the community was a, like, anthroposophical-based community, so it was a Camp Hill community, and it was based on kind of the work around development that Rudolf Steiner had, like all of his work kind of that Rudolf Steiner had done, and then Karl Koenig, who ended up founding this community, borrowed and adapted a lot from kind of Steiner's theology. So I was in this space that I was doing kind of a lot of physical labor with people who had developmental disabilities, and I think there's something which I think is tremendously healing in doing care work, like particularly kind of like direct service care work, where you're actually kind of like working with people's bodies, and like people are allowing you to kind of like be with their bodies. And I think that experience kind of helped. I just felt really stuck. Like I kind of went over there feeling really stuck, and I think I started to kind of become unstuck. And I don't even know what I was exactly. I think I was like stuck too much in consciousness. I think that's what was going on. But I think this experience of kind of working directly with people's bodies and people whose cognitive capacities were different than my own, it just totally changed what I thought I was capable of and what other people were capable of. And I think kind of like when I ended up going into Dublin and seeing the Yeats exhibition, I think it kind of solidified how much I believe that kind of like spiritual practice is connected to kind of like care work and like and also to like how care work and spiritual practice needs to be like central in my writing in order for me to write anything.
And where were you in your own kind of development or trajectory when you decided to go to Ireland?
I'd really struggled to get through undergrad, and it just like took forever, and I was really not not doing particularly well. And I think I had spent so much time focusing on myself and kind of my own wellness that I just wanted something that wasn't focused on me. Like, I really kind of wanted to be a part of a community structure, and I wanted the care that, you know, was being performed, that it wasn't focused on me, that I was just sick of kind of giving care to myself, and I was sick of having other people that I love and I'm close to kind of like perform care on me. Like, it just was too much. And so I really wanted to go into a community structure and just, I hope that this is a healing place for me. And it was a lot of things. I do think it was very healing. Because I mean, it was really actually a fairly remarkable experience. I really had fairly bad OCD at the time that I was going into it. And I think it was this strange thing that, like, I just, a lot of these tics that I had began to kind of disappear out of, like, necessity in some ways, just because I was always so busy and exhausted. And also, too, there's just a lot going on, like, but it was this kind of strange thing of coming out of myself and into the community. And it was just what I needed at the time. And I'm really glad I made that decision. And I also really love Ireland. I think my family is Irish. And I've lived there in the past, and I just really like kind of how it feels like the sky and the ground are connected, just because it's just always so damp. It's like being underwater.
It's a beautiful way to describe it.
But yeah, going back, it was kind of going back to, like, when you asked where I was at, like, when I went to the community, what was kind of interesting is around kind of this anthroposophical idea of development. We were learning a lot about kind of like these different stages that people go through, and it's like connected to the planet. So, like, initially it's like moon stage. And that's like from 0 to 7, and it's when psychic forces are kind of working to transform the body. So someone's like both simultaneously kind of a product of their parents and are also kind of in the early stages of individualization. And like young kids are also thought to be like very tied to the earth, like within an anthroposophic mindset. And then like people go, I think the next one after the moon is Mercury, and that has to do with like imagination formation and kind of creating like this other world for yourself. And then from 14 to 21, it's going up by 7s, is Venus and kind of developing like a higher mind. And then there's also kind of more of like an eroticism, which is beginning to develop. And it's not until Steiner didn't believe that you like came into, like your ego wasn't fully formed until you were anywhere from like, it happened sometime in the 20s, but like you really couldn't have a fully formed ego until you were 21. And then from 21 to 42, you're like, that's kind of your sun time. And that's really kind of about like consciousness and building sentience for yourself and intellect. And then in later years, it's Mars, and that's when you're working to actually kind of make some kind of imprint on the world. But I really like kind of how slow the developmental progression is, just because and that's kind of like what poetry is for me. It's something that's very slow, and I feel like I'm in the process with my poetry right now of just trying to create consciousness and kind of build intellect through poetry. And like whatever ends up happening, like I think I'll have more clarity as like what that will mean for me, maybe in a larger way, like in many, many years from now.
Yeah, and Steiner's way of thinking about the world and his education system is amazing. In the U.S., they call them Waldorf schools, but Waldorf schooling is Steiner schooling, and how he's so focused on creativity and like not having subjects being separate, but having them people learn like in a more holistic way, where you learn many different things at one time, or use things more actively. Creativity and using your body and like constructing the books and all sorts of things.
Yeah. Well, I love the fact that there is such a conscious art practice, or like kind of an aesthetic practice that goes into Waldorf education. Like even in terms of the buildings that they construct for the schools, it's all very like round and open. And yeah, I saw at the, I'm going to like butcher her name, but at the Guggenheim.
Hilma af Klint.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I find her name so hard to pronounce, but it was funny because I didn't know anything about her and was going through the Guggenheim. I was like, this is so Steinery in its colors. And then there was a lot of mention to her connection with Steiner and kind of occult practice as well. But yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about kind of a connection between color theory and nature and kind of how that helps ground people to space. And I definitely feel more present in the world when there's some kind of aesthetic cohesion. Like not in an exclusionary way, but just in kind of like a make things beautiful way.
What was your experience of Hilma af Klint's work like?
It was amazing. It was amazing, I think, just because it's so revolutionary. Like the fact that she would have the foresight to say, don't release this work until at least 20 years after my death. But in some ways I'm so curious, like what would have happened had it been released prior to that? And I don't know. But I do think it just kind of also goes back to kind of how women's voices are obscured and, you know, how that continues. I mean, so many people's voices, so many marginalized people have their voices obscured, and it's always, I understand it, and it's also something which is just very painfully sad to me, and I think kind of needs to be actively worked against. And that's why I'm so into community structures as well, like very kind of holistic, inclusive community structures that are aiming to create an environment where people really can be nourished and feel like they have the capacity for growth. But yeah, I mean, I think seeing her work, I think primarily I was just incredibly inspired. Like I ended up going home that night and drawing. I went into the basement of my building. I live in New York, and there's always like old cardboard boxes, and I like ripped up the cardboard boxes and then took these pastels I had and was just kind of drawing and making shapes and like really just having kind of this continuous flow. And it was really beautiful. And like through that I began thinking a lot about kind of like memory and kind of ways to resurrect my memory, just because I realized through this process of drawing, I was like, I don't have a 3D concept of my memory. Like they're all very flat. And I kind of wanted more of an ability to kind of like go in to my memory and make it something that was an actual space and not just an image. So that was a good exercise.
That's a wonderful thing to think about, like the idea of memories being flat or just an image versus like having an experiential quality to them.
Yeah, I think so I sleep really, really deeply, and I kind of sometimes I sleep like a bizarre amount. Like sleep is a really important part of my life, and I lucid dream and also have like fairly intense sleep paralysis, and I always remember my dreams, and like my dreams, it is a sensory experience. Like I'll feel pain and I can like taste things in my dream, and smell not so much, but certainly I'm hearing things, and it's I'm always kind of struck by like how alert my senses are in this kind of sleep space. But my sleep space isn't like when I'm trying to recall a memory. Like it is actually a landscape, and a lot of my dreams are constructed around certain memories, obviously, and experiences which I've had, and can generally render them pretty accurately. So it's just interesting kind of how I have the capacity to see things in, I think, kind of a multi-dimensional way when I'm in a dream state, but don't have that necessarily so much when I'm waking. But for me, it's really important. I think like I like having consciousness as much as, and I like even consciousness over kind of like subconscious maybe sometimes, which I find it really important to like have as active of a life in my dream state as I do in my waking state. Mm-hmm. And that was a lot of my book, Another Life, that was a lot of what was going on in that book, that it really was writing about dream state and just kind of this strange transition that kind of I experience daily between kind of like, I always feel like it's being underwater and then kind of being pulled to the surface. And
I really love that book. Would you mind talking a little bit about it and your process making it?
Yeah. So happy that you like that book. It was written fairly quickly, and actually it's, what's interesting about it, I've mentioned I kind of got into writing a little bit, not late, but I think it was something that I knew it would come to me, and I was just waiting for it to come. And Another Life was really kind of like, it's hard to explain just because I actually haven't had a similar writing experience since then, of just kind of a ability to rapidly produce, and during that time, I read it fairly quickly, like over a 3-month period of time. I was laid off from a job, which I really hated. And it was when I work as a social worker now, and I had like a little bit of a crisis in terms of not knowing if I wanted to be a social worker. And so this was kind of a brief period of time where I knew I was going to go back into social work. So I was like studying to take my licensing exam and was just like looking for work in public sector agencies. But I also was just sleeping a lot and would have like very severe lead-in paralysis during the day during sleep, and just like could not wake up. And I found myself when I would wake up, it was just like such a relief to be awake again, just because sometimes I would think I had died in my dreams. But like I was like, if I can't wake up, that only means like I'm dead. So for some reason, that kind of state of panic helped me to write, because I would write a lot of times after I woke up. And I would also write late at night as well. Like I was working, just to make some extra cash, I was working at a nightclub, and it was an experience I didn't really love just because I don't like loud noises and I don't really like people very much. But I think it was like so outside of my element, and I felt so brave doing it in a lot of ways that, like when I would be on the subway going back home, I like would just write on the subway, and it just felt like it was there. Like I didn't really feel like I was, like I felt like I was able to articulate kind of what was happening in my life in a way that I haven't been able to articulate before, or I hadn't been able to articulate before. So, and it's like very personal what I was writing, and it has to do a lot. Like the book has to do a lot with, it has to do a lot with dream and waking state. And I think also too, at that time, I was also, I'm like very interested in reincarnation and kind of also how like reincarnation is linked to dream states. So the book was also somewhat a reflection on that. I think just because it was such a transitional time. And I assume death is a very transitional time. Like not just the process of dying, but death itself, being dead.
And is that where the title was pulled from?
Yeah, that was where the title was pulled from. Initially it was going to be called Another Lifetime, but I thought Another Life was more concise and sounded better.
And what are you working on now?
Working on a couple of different things. So I'm really interested right now in Ana Cristina Cesar, who's a Brazilian poet. And she died from suicide when she was 31. And I began writing to her in some ways, like the project started out as kind of, it's like an anti-suicide note. It's like a letter to like tell her I wish she hadn't died. And I think it's funny just because like I am writing to her, but I'm writing to me. And I think, she's just a little bit older than I am right now. And I think I kind of started writing to her because I began to feel kind of a fear of death in a way that I haven't felt since I was like 12. and I don't totally understand like why that fear emerged again. I think, I mean, I'm definitely like a depressed person, and I think like whatever, it's funny, I think just because I work as a social worker and I'm a clinical social worker, so I work with people who, predominantly like could be, given kind of a diagnosis, or like meet criteria for diagnoses of, anxiety and depression, since I do behavioral therapy and I work with a lot of people who are suicidal. And I also think it's just such an interesting thing to think about, because like you can be so sick from depression and like maybe your body's kind of falling apart because you're not taking care of yourself, but in a lot of ways like there's still a lot of health in you. And I think I'm just very interested kind of with the fatigue which is attached to depression, and I was very interested in kind of Anna Christina's work because she was so prolific during her lifetime and had so much acclaim. And I think I'm starting to move back from this, but I used to say for a long time, like, poetry saved me. Like, it saved me. Like, I wouldn't, like, it gave me so much. And, like, I don't even want to imagine, like, myself without poetry. Like, I just, like, poetry is just, it's, like, writing poetry, like, it's just, like, the community space it's built, like, it's like magic. And, like, this magic that I've just kind of desperately been trying to find. And so, yeah, I think I was so interested, like, why didn't poetry save you, Anna Christina? And yeah, I mean, it's a project that I feel a little bit, I'm a white American, and I actually don't really know very much about Anna Christina's background, just because she was only translated recently. And I've been doing a little bit of, I don't speak Brazilian Portuguese, but I've been doing a little bit of independent translation. And it's just because I don't speak Portuguese, it's been very difficult to find a lot of background. And from what I've found, it seems like she was a queer woman, and she had a lot of connection to England. And I'm not sure if her family was English in some capacity, or if I don't really understand like how she was in terms of kind of the diaspora in Brazil and kind of what her family background was. But it's strange to kind of write this thing to someone where I don't want it to be seen as me taking advantage or kind of blame over someone's death. Like, it's really not what I'm trying to write towards. Like, I think I just, like, I'm just so captivated by, like, why, like, what happened. Like, I just really want to know what happened. And, like, I think that's kind of why I'm writing with her, or writing to her. So I'm working on that project, and, hopefully that will find space to live at some point. It's exciting to me, this project. And a little excerpt from this from the manuscript is going to be published, I think, in March. And I also did a corresponding interview with Vicky now, where she was just asking me a little bit about the project. And V's been very instrumental. She's been kind of like a mentor to me in a lot of ways. So was really good to have that conversation with her. So I'm working on that project, and then I have another project entitled Glass Animals, which is it's centered on being witness to animal trauma, but I'm kind of struggling with that just because I don't want it to be exploitive of animals. I just really love animals, and I just feel like I've witnessed like a strange amount of animal suffering. Like I seem to like attract, like it's very odd. Like I really do. Like there was like a pigeon I like ended up having to be euthanized, but like I just am constantly finding like hurt birds, or like a bird flew into my house and died, and I used to live in Michigan, and I just constantly was finding like dogs and cats and just like all these animals, and I don't know. I feel like I have that a little bit with humans too, and maybe I'm just looking for it. But yeah, I just want to kind of write about the experience of like witnessing animal pain and kind of what that is. But I'm struggling with that. I'm having kind of a hard time with it. And the other project I'm working on is I always mispronounce her name. I have the saint's card of Saint, I guess it's Dymphna. Mm-hmm. So I'm writing about that, and I'm kind of writing about her in relationship to my work as a clinical social worker and care laborer. And
she's said to be the patron saint of like mental health care workers.
Yeah. And she also is attached to like depression and incest, and had a very interesting life, and her legacy does live on in various ways. So that's a newer project, and so I feel like I'm working on numerous things right now. In a lot of ways, they're all like fairly connected. I'm not always the best with organizations. I'm just trying to kind of group a little bit, kind of what I've been thinking about, just so I can kind of clarify it through writing. It's funny, just because I'm a behavioral therapist, I always kind of like, you have to like write yourself behaviorally before you can do like more explicit talk therapy. And I'm not sure if that's true. It's just like, it is funny. I feel like I've kind of finally reached a time in my own life that I've been such a, I love dialectical behavioral therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's the therapy I do, but it's also, it is so kind of grounded in the day-to-day, and it's kind of good to make these connections with you, but I don't necessarily allow myself to make with other people. Just talking about things I'm interested in.
Yeah, and that's why I always say, like, to me it's a shame. Like, when I went to graduate school, I didn't realize that I was going to a more, like, CBT grad school program. I learned, of course, about, Freud and psychoanalysis, and then, like, Skinner and Pavlov and the behaviorists. And I learned about all of these different things in undergrad. But to me, it seemed clear that all of these different modalities of working address different aspects of like human life and human behavior, and that they can all be useful in their own way at different times or in different ways for different people. So I didn't even realize that the field was so divided when I started graduate school, that I would be entering a program and then I was like, wait, where's Freud? And then I had to like seek him out. But I'm glad that I was able to kind of get the experience of all these different kinds of training, because, if I have a patient, even if they're coming in for analysis, they're having panic attacks, and I know breathing exercises that can help manage those symptoms, why would I not give those to them? Why would I withhold that information? So I feel like a combination of like the talk therapy or looking at childhood and old patterns with kind of psychoeducation and more like explicit skills like stress management helps,
Totally. And I think one thing that I'm always so curious, I'm like so interested in some ways is like, I'm not a particularly academic person. Like, it's just interesting for me because care work and care labor is something which is just so instinctual and intuitive. And like, I've gone through a lot of schooling. Like I've gone to various institutes to get supplemental postgraduate training. And it's funny though, because you can't, like there is something very undefinable and spiritual about creating an environment which is healing or giving. I mean, for me, I really I see myself as someone who's just trying to promote like belief in life and like belief in healing and like, because really, at least I hold this, I guess, true for myself and doesn't need to be true for everyone else. But I mean, I really do think a lot of living is kind of, at least, I think there are many other components, but I do think it's also learning how to kind of tolerate discomfort. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I do think I'm totally with you. I think like kind of combined modalities and then also just like kind of a, that kind of like spiritual, just like heart quality that you can bring into care work is really important.
Yeah, and I think there is an intuitive sense, like you said, about the work that can't really be taught. You can give people tools as therapists, as people going into the field of like different ways in which they can work. But I feel like most people have an intuitive way. Like there was a reason that we went into the field in the first place. Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a conversation with poet and therapist KATIE EBBITT. For more, check out her chapbook, Another Life, from Counterpath Press, and our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. Or to allow for, however, and the other, to voyeurism, ray of sunshine, things to, force that gives it body. The words come, they did not seem, place where desire is, progression, opening doors, nothing kills desire, becoming formless, we call them. Libido, I have a dream, wanting or not wanting, the story of our fetishized immediacy, to know anything we didn't know existed. Tarot is in an act of speaking, with choice, investigation of what is at this knowledge, folds in on, of the working. And see what needs to be done further